I am going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Emilie Blevins is a senior conservation biologist and freshwater mussel lead for the Xerces Society. Her work on Western freshwater mussels has focused on leading surveys to support conservation and restoration efforts, developing guidelines to reduce land and water management impacts to mussel beds, and conducting research to assess mussel die-offs and other emerging concerns. In addition to her position at the Xerces Society, she is also the chair of the Pacific Northwest Native Freshwater Mussel Group. Her recent work has focused on freshwater invertebrates, but she does have a lot of experience working with aquatic habitat restoration, as well as a wide range of species. And I am really excited to hear her presentation today. I feel like aquatic invertebrates in general, and especially bivalves, often get overlooked in conservation and riparian restoration efforts. So I'm really excited to hear what she has to share. Thank you, Emilie. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of freshwater mussels, because I think a lot of people are not as familiar with them, particularly people in the plant world. So I'm also going to then bring that link back to riparian restoration as well. So that background, and I apologize, there's a little delay in my slides here. So the background that I want to give is just starting, what a freshwater mussel actually is, because I think a lot of people hear the term mussel and first think of some of our invasive species, or may have encountered some of those species in their work in the field. So I just thought I'd start by pointing out some of those differences between species like the Asian clam, which many people might encounter. That's actually a non-native species that was introduced into the Columbia Basin a long time ago, and differs really importantly from freshwater mussels, in part because it doesn't use a host fish, which is a key aspect of freshwater mussel biology. And I'll explain that on one of the next slides. But this is a species you might have encountered at sites and wondered what it was. And so that's not what we're talking about today. And also, we're not talking about zebra and quagga mussels, which are a really concerning non-native species that was introduced into the Great Lakes in the 80s. And like the Asian clam, doesn't require a host fish, which has made its ability to invade new habitats really quite easy, particularly because it does attach to infrastructure or boats or other things that can be transported from one place to another. They're small. They use byssal thread to attach to even living things like native freshwater mussels, like you see in this image. And then fortunately, they have not yet been introduced to Washington State, but of course that's a big concern. And when people hear the term freshwater mussel, that's often what their first thought is. But we do have native species in Western North America, as well as Eastern North America. These are, like the other two species, they're bivalve mollusks that have gills that filter water to breathe and feed. Our native mussels do use a host fish, so I'll show a diagram of that in just a minute. But they are benthic and burrowing, so they have a muscular foot that they use to burrow into the bottom substrate as compared to resting on the surface or affixing themselves to something. And they do form large beds in areas where there's good habitat and healthy populations. And these are really long-lived species compared with the other non-native species, but also compared to other aquatic macroinvertebrates. And there are multiple species that are found in Washington State, as well as all of the Western United States that I'll be talking about today. These are imperiled species, and so that's the next thing that I just wanted to briefly touch on. Freshwater mussels, as well as freshwater snails, are the most imperiled wildlife in North America. with huge rates of extinction. So for freshwater mussels, North America is a hotspot of biodiversity, and so of our original 300 native species of mussels, we now have more than 30 species that have gone extinct, so more than 10% of our native fauna. And the native fauna to North America constitutes almost a third of what's found globally. So there's real concern about impacts to our native species. You know, historically, some of those issues were things like overharvest. So in the eastern US, there was a thriving pearl button industry for many years that resulted in the harvest of more than 1 billion mussels from those waterways over more than 50 years. And systemic habitat destruction from the building of large dams and waterways led to some huge declines in some of the native species there, including the direct extinction of several species. But there are many chronic threats that freshwater mussels face. These include things like habitat alteration, water management practices that result in changes to flow and water level, especially drying of habitat. And then invasive species are also a major concern. With the introduction of zebra mussels to the eastern US, there were huge declines in native freshwater mussel species as well. So that's a real concern should some of those species become established in Western North America as well. There are also some recent and emerging issues specific to our Western mussels that I wanted to touch on, and these include things like enigmatic die-offs. These are examples of large, healthy freshwater mussel beds that, like the one depicted in that bottom picture on the right, will suddenly die en masse from an unknown cause, often without other aquatic species being affected at the same time. So you may not see a concurrent fish die-off. So this is a Western pearlshell bed from southwestern Washington that we've been studying with partners at WDFW to determine the causes of this die-off. But we have seen these in other places, including in Oregon and possibly some sites in Idaho. Lack of reproduction is also a concern among our mussel populations. It was really interesting to see the diagrams of the tree canopy and the kind of loss of those younger age classes and recruitment, because we have similar examples of that with freshwater mussels, where you may see these large, productive looking beds that lack those younger age classes. And so, you know, one example is a study in California that found in one river, Western pearlshell bed had not reproduced in as many as 30 years, totally lacking age classes and size classes over that 30-year span. So that's a real concern for mussel populations as well. Climate change is also a real concern, in part because freshwater mussels are very sensitive to poor water quality and elevated water temperatures. And those water temperatures also control interactions between host fish and freshwater mussels. And so if there's a mismatch in timing, much like with pollinators and the flowers that they rely on, that can impact future generations. So, so those things combined with things as well as, you know, simple loss of habitat are real concerns into the future for mussels. And just to give you a brief overview of mussel life history, what has really set these species apart is the fact that there's a larval stage that does rely on a host fish to complete reproduction, from a glochidium to a juvenile. And that larval stage attaches to a fish for about a week and a half or several weeks before metamorphosing and dropping off to become a filter feeding mussel. And during that time period, that's when mussels have the ability really to make the long distance movements, because otherwise mussels are pretty sedentary throughout their lifespan. So fish are a way for them to move from one location to another within a watershed. And mussels are long-lived and can be quite productive. So the Western pearlshell is a great example of that. It's a species that can live to more than 100 years. often all within the same patch of river habitat where it first settled as a juvenile. It's a species that relies on only salmonids to complete its life cycle. So, if it were to attach to other species of fish, she wouldn't result in a viable juvenile mussel. So there's a tight link between Western pearlshell and our native salmonids. And this species is distributed widely throughout Western North America, or once was, from Alaska east to Montana, and south into California. It can be really abundant in places where it thrives. So some beds can exceed many tens of thousands of mussels in just one small area, with as many as 400 mussels packed one on top of each other. And you can identify mussels by looking at the papillae, which I just wanted to point out in this photo. This is an area around the in-current siphon where the mussel is actually pulling in water, and that's a diagnostic feature that can help you identify species, as well as some shell features. And I'll provide a link to a resource where you can look at that some more. We also have multiple species of mussels in the genus Anodonta, as well as a species in the genus Synanodonta. And we collectively refer to these as floater mussels because they are difficult to distinguish from one another, in part because there are very few characteristics on a mussel to actually help you identify morphologically. This group of species can live up to 20 years as well, so not quite as old as the Western pearlshell, but still a relatively long lifespan, and can use a wider range of host fish to complete reproduction. So that might include salmonids, but it also could include three-spined stickleback or dace and other small fish species. This group has a relatively wide distribution among all species in the group, and so floater mussels have been reported from northern Mexico all the way up into the Arctic and east through to the continental divide. Again, there are multiple species that look similar, but they are quite genetically distinct, and we're learning more about those differences among species, including potential preferences for certain host fish. But again, the papillae that you see here can be diagnostic for determining this group of species from the other kinds of mussels. And then lastly, I wanted to introduce you to our final Western species of freshwater mussel. That's the Western ridge mussel. It's the only member of its genus, so quite unique among mussels. And it's quite long-lived as well. It can live to more than 60 years of age and can use sculpin and dace as its host fish. But this species has a more limited distribution in Western North America. It is found in Washington as well as Idaho, but not into Montana and not south into Arizona or Mexico. This species is somewhat more cryptic, so here you can see it's nearly buried to the apertures, the in-current and ex-current openings there. And it does have those distinct papillae, again, to help you identify it. But this species has suffered the greatest declines of our Western mussel species. And so among our Western species, this is one that the Xerces Society is going to be petitioning for endangered species listing this summer. So here's just a nice example of what we know about the distribution of mussels in Washington State. This is data that comes from our Western Freshwater Mussel database, which I encourage you all to submit your mussel observations to. And if you would like information on where freshwater mussels have been reported, we have point data associated with this. But this is a joint project between the Xerces Society and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And this database does span the entire range of our Western species, not just Washington. But what I wanted to point out here is that we do have some data gaps including the watersheds you see in stripe here. And these are places where mussel data would be really valuable. But generally what I wanted to show you is that these species can occur together, sometimes in mixed beds, sometimes distributed in different habitats throughout watersheds. But in large part, we do see the different species kind of widespread throughout the state. And so I just wanted to touch on the importance of freshwater mussels as well. These are species that spend, like I said, many decades in the bottoms of streams filtering. And this is a key piece of their role in an aquatic environment. And that's that they are capturing nutrients that would otherwise be moving downstream. They're removing suspended solids and pollutants from water. So mussels can remove pesticides, flame retardants, other chemicals, and water can essentially exit much cleaner on the other side of a mussel bed. And in really dense beds, water can be filtered through multiple mussels before it reaches the end of a bed. So they have an incredible capacity to clean water to the benefit of fish. And they also increase benthic complexity by creating habitat both when they're alive and when they've died and all that's left behind is their shell. They serve as food for other species like river otters, and historically were, culturally important for multiple tribes in the Pacific Northwest. Mussels can also increase food for fish in the form of other macroinvertebrates. Studies have shown that species like lamprey can actually grow faster in the presence of freshwater mussel beds. So they have this really critical role that they play and really improve aquatic habitats. And the types of habitats that these species are found in is pretty wide ranging. So some of our species do occur in lakes and ponds, including floodplain ponds. They can also occur in headwater streams and very small creeks like the one you see here, as well as our major rivers. And even in water bodies that otherwise you might not think are good mussel habitat. This is an example in the far right of a creek in northeastern Oregon, where in just this one puddle in an otherwise drying stream, there were more than 300 western pearlshell mussels packed in. So it can be surprising where you could encounter them, but it's important to keep in mind because you can't really discount particular habitat just because it doesn't look necessarily like what you might expect mussels would occur in. So the habitat features that mussels clue into are things like stability, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. But these stable features like large rocks in the stream provide kind of similar to what was talked about in the last presentation, but that hydraulic protection. Mussels are easily scoured out of habitat because they do rely on that muscular foot to help them burrow into the bottom. And so they are easily scoured when there's not something that can sort of protect and take the brunt of that flow. So stability is really key. And that can also come from diverse structure provided by riparian and aquatic plants. It's very common to see mussels in the bottoms of these rooted plant networks along the edges or banks of streams and lakes because, again, they provide some roughness and protection. And then mussels also do rely on good burrowing material to help them, particularly to burrow up and down throughout the seasons in response to changes in flow and timing for reproduction. And then, as I mentioned, host fish are really critical. Without that special link between fish and mussels, you don't have the next generation. And I just wanted to place this in a watershed context as well, because I know many of us look at restoration plans from kind of that 10,000 foot perspective. And it can be really challenging to identify places where mussels occur on the landscape with a few exceptions, and I like to show this example as a great exception to that. On the left-hand side is the Smith River in California, which is an undammed river. As you can see, it has a lot of stream power with those scoured gravel beds. This is a river that can go anywhere from several hundred CFS at low water up to more than 100,000 CFS during high water and storms. And freshwater mussels in this case are western pearlshell beds represented by the green dots in each of these images. So the Smith River is on the left, and a tributary to the Smith, Mill Creek, is on the right. And what I just wanted to point out is that you'll see these green dots on the Smith River are occurring mainly at bends within that river. And that's associated with these stable features that are bedrock impingements into the river. And that's where soft sediments, fine sediments will settle out, and mussels will find that refuge, the hydraulic flow refuge that enables them to burrow into fine sediments. In comparison, on the right-hand side is a much smaller stream that has much less flow dominance as far as the overarching structure of the stream. It's not dictated necessarily by those high flows that will scour and move substrate around. And in that case, western pearlshell are distributed almost continuously because they have the burrowing material available to them, and they're not at risk of being kind of washed out of their habitat. So it's important to place areas that you might work into context, because you can get differences in mussel distribution depending on kind of how your river operates. And I wanted to show this example of that importance of stability when you take a peek under the water. And these two images are from the Middle Fork Willamette River below Dexter Dam in Oregon. And on the left-hand side, you can see there were many tens of thousands of western pearlshell mussels, all burrowed into very soft sediments that had deposited in a side channel along the main stem river. In this area, that was a very protected site originally, but following the high flows of 2018, 2019 in the winter, there was a lot of rearranging, and this side channel had kind of a new cut into the gravel bar that protected the area where mussels had been thriving. And the result was that in patches of this otherwise very dense, healthy mussel bed, there were areas that large numbers of mussels had probably been scoured out and smothered and tumbled and died subsequently. So stability really has the potential to impact these beds. Even a single event can cause mussel beds to really be damaged. And one of the things that I like to think of when I look at this site is to remember that these really dense mussel beds are so critical to the future of species in these rivers, because where you have such dense mussels in a naturally changing and active river channel, you would expect to see these kinds of events happen where channels shift and change. It's perfectly natural, but you do need a healthy mussel population to withstand something like that, so that there will be the potential to kind of rebuild that population after an event. So stability is really critical for mussels. And part of that stability, as I showed, can come from the riparian vegetation or in-stream aquatic vegetation that can help to stabilize naturally some of these habitats. So I wanted to show a couple examples of where habitat degradation can have an impact on freshwater mussels. The first image on the left, just to orient you, as you're looking across the bank, to the left is the upstream portion of a creek. This is in the North Fork John Day Basin in Oregon. There's a backwater eddy that you can see with some water swirling around the bank here. And this is actually a stream that still has maintained a lot of sinuosity and still has good bottom habitat, but as you can see with changes in the riparian habitat, that edge of the river, that bank, is largely degraded. And if you were to peek your head below the surface, what you would see is really barren, scoured out bank. However, there is a single shrub here that's holding on, and in fact, that is the location where we were able to find straggling freshwater mussels burrowed into and among the roots. So this habitat, even small amounts of it can allow these species to persist in otherwise inhospitable landscapes. On the right-hand side is an example of a creek in, again, in the Willamette Basin in Oregon. You can see overgrown blackberry forms the majority of the riparian habitat here. And as a result, very few mussels were found along that stream margin. There was one, but generally a stream like this should be able to support large populations of bottom habitat, but riparian edge has been degraded. We often see that riparian edge has degraded. We see fewer mussels in of sites. And we have similar issues with degradation. So because freshwater mussels are not able to affixate, freshwater are able to fix themselves to rocks, the way mussels in the intertidal zone, marine mussels. Mussels typically will only survive in areas where there are these pockets of burrowing habitat, as well as that protection, that stability that I mentioned. So in the image on the left, this is a coastal stream in Oregon where bedrock dominates the bottom substrate of the stream because of historical loss of large wood and other features. But mussels can still persist in these areas where even a small pocket enables them to burrow in and get that hydraulic refuge. On the right-hand side is an example from the creek I showed earlier with that backwater eddy. This is an example of where a piece of the bank has actually fallen into the creek and continued to grow, showing the issue of erosion there. But again, even at sites like this, in the immediate area around this clump of vegetation is where mussels have settled out, almost as though they're boulders. So it's almost like mussels are doing their best just to hang on here, given just a little bit of protection from those high flows and the right kind of burrowing habitat. And this is particularly important for juvenile mussels, which often burrow very shallowly into the bottom substrate. They're quite easily scoured out from high flows, and so where a mussel lands is often where it's going to spend its life, and so it's really important that these pockets of habitat are available to them. They can make it through those critical small stages and then grow into an adult that's going to live possibly the next century. So I'll switch gears a little bit now just to talk about some freshwater mussel best management practices. The Xerces Society collaborated with others to develop a set of recommendations to help improve the management and protection of mussels at sites where restoration or construction happens in stream or bankside. And this is because freshwater mussels can be incredibly sensitive to restoration practices, particularly where things like dewatering is necessary, or there would be construction along the bank or in the channel. If you imagine sites where, for example, a stage 0 restoration site where a channel is filled, or even spawning gravel augmentation can bury mussels. These are all activities that, although they can improve the habitat in the long term, if mussels aren't taken into account, they can be directly killed by some of these activities. And so the idea was to develop a set of recommendations that enables people to move forward with restoration, but to avoid impacts to mussels during those projects, so that hopefully mussels can also benefit from those activities. So we developed a set of best management practices you can access and download for free at that link, Conservations of Our Waters. The mussel-friendly restoration link there also provides you with some identification information for each of the species, as well as kind of a summary of the BMPs. And then I mentioned the mussel database, which is available to you all if you're interested in what species might be present in your area or would like to report your own observations of mussels. You can reach out to me and I can facilitate that data exchange. So there are some techniques that are really critical to implementing the best management practices to protect mussels when you're in work. So the first step is always just to conduct those surveys to determine if mussels are present at your site. Getting that information from the mussel database can help, but surveys can be done by snorkeling, by wading, but generally, just getting out there and looking to see what you have and where mussels occur within a project site is the really critical first step, because then the next step is to overlay your mussel observations with your planned restoration activities so that you can identify those areas of potential impact. This is a nice example from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, where they mapped mussel beds in yellow in relation to other work activities, and then were able to plan restoration actions to protect mussels and also to remove them from areas where they could be impacted. So this is a really key step as well. And again, those areas where there's potential impact can include, if you're doing invasive plant removal, freshwater mussels can be incredibly sensitive to some of the surfactants that are combined with herbs. Mussels can also be damaged by removal of invasive aquatic plants because they can also get uprooted when those plants are removed. Things like rototilling in lakes can negatively impact mussel beds. I mentioned watering. That can have a truly significant impact on mussels because they must stay inundated throughout their lives. And so there are techniques that you can implement to slowly dewater and remove mussels as they emerge from the bottom substrate so that they can be translocated to a new site. And then, of course, any activities where there are specific locations that, for example, a log jam could be placed. Considering ideas for where you could relocate those movable structures to protect existing beds is really valuable versus simply just planning to move mussels out of the way. And this also can help you identify areas of potential enhancement for mussels. So if you map known beds and can identify places where they aren't, those are places that might be good to target specific structures that can enhance habitat for them. So some of the tips in the best management practices include things like timing your work to avoid sensitive life stages. So if it's possible to delay work that would occur during mussel breeding, that would be beneficial. In part because freshwater mussels are especially sensitive while breeding because they do brood the eggs and release the larvae from their gills. So they actually have reduced capacity to breathe during this time period. So they can be more sensitive to water quality issues. If you're able to leave as much existing beneficial habitat on site as possible, that's always good for mussels because those are places where they have the potential to thrive in the long term. And then planning for potential salvage and relocation efforts in advance is really critical because unlike a fish salvage, you can't really show up the day of the salvage and just put mussels in a bucket and dump them somewhere else. You have to identify appropriate habitat for them to be moved into. And there are different steps to take that into account. So it's really beneficial if you've done that survey in advance to then have that in mind as you plan a potential salvage and relocation effort. It's also really beneficial, like I said, if you can just simply avoid an area where mussels are located by providing a buffer around those sites that can help protect them. And, just as an example, a log jam like this, if placed directly on a mussel bed, would have the potential to lead to direct crushing and scour. but it also has the potential to create good bottom substrate habitat for them and to promote a healthy stream bottom and stream edge. So it's critical to just keep in mind where you're placing those and how you can avoid mussel beds while also identifying places where, if mussels aren't there, this is an opportunity to create not just fish habitat, but also mussel habitat. Promoting pockets of stability is really valuable for mussels. These margins of streams are often in big rivers in particular. Those shorelines and banks are the places where mussels will typically occur rather than in the thalweg of the river or in riffles or areas of high flow. And so often these nice patches of vegetation similar to log jams can help promote some of those fine sediments to deposit and to become stabilized by roots. And in the case of the image on the left, this is the Klamath River in California. In the area of those bulrushes, that typically ended up being a clue that freshwater mussels would be present at a site, because in association with those patches is where we found the right substrate, and then mussels would be present in much higher density in those areas. Kind of interesting too, those are sites where predators like the otters knew that mussels were present, and so you might notice that the bulrush patch looks a little bit disheveled there, and in part that's because we were finding an animal midden there, a site that mussels were being harvested by the local otter as well. But these areas where rooted vegetation helps to promote good bottom habitat is where we also tend to see mussels. And so those stream banks, like I said, are really critical for mussels. Where we have degraded stream banks, that's where we tend to see mussel populations disappear and what otherwise should be their best habitat. So, the presence of cows in stream where they trample banks, they have the potential to really impact mussel habitat and to even directly crush mussels. So we often see that in places with or without cattle, there's a distinct difference in the same river, whether or not they've been fenced off or not, as far as the presence of mussels. And then the real payoff here is that in these areas with nice healthy riparian vegetation with nice root networks where that habitat has been created, like you see on the left, if you stick your head under the water like the snorkeler there, what you see are essentially a mussel nursery. That's a western pearlshell mussel tucked in among the roots in that spot that you see on the left. And as I mentioned, juveniles are much more sensitive to scour in stream habitats. So it's really encouraging when you do find these reproductive populations. They're often in close association with really healthy looking bank habitats. So there's such a link between restoration and riparian habitat and freshwater mussels in many of our streams. I just want to close by letting you know that we do have resources available to help you at Xerces, and those include the links to the documents that I shared on a previous slide, as well as the Western Freshwater Mussel Database. We also host workshops, which include a classroom component like in the middle, and can help with identification and learning some of the techniques in the BMPs like you see at left. So these are all ways that we're doing outreach to help people incorporate mussels into their restoration work. And then lastly, I just want to encourage you all to check out the Pacific Northwest Native Freshwater Mussel Work Group at pnwmussels.org. We're a group of individuals from agencies, tribes, nonprofits, consulting firms, and interested individuals who share information and research on freshwater mussels. You can join that work group by getting in touch with me. I'm the work group chair, and we can add you to the listserv. But we'll be hosting a symposium next spring on freshwater mussels. We had one originally planned for this spring of this year, but we were unable to hold it in light of COVID as well. So we're rescheduling that. But with that, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
All right, thank you, Emilie. That's a lot of good information, and I think really important for those of us that are doing projects in conservation to keep in mind and use some of those resources. There are a couple questions that came in here. First of all, how do you go about an initial mussel survey over a large area, say a reach of the Yakima River?
Yeah, that's a great question. Often the best thing you can do is to try to identify areas that you think will have the best habitat available for mussels. So hopefully based on what I just showed you, you would have some idea in your mind of these patches that just look better. And then navigating to those sites first is often your best option. And when you're there, you want to look for things like empty shells, which fortunately are quite colorful and shine in the light. So you can, if you find a freshwater mussel shell, that's a good sign. You should keep searching for the bed. You can also do surveys from a boat. So if it is a large river, you can boat along the edge. And if you have something like an aquascope, like you could see in that slide where I was snorkeling and someone was standing on the bank, or you can put on a snorkel mask and lean over the side. But that is a really handy way to cover a larger area by first targeting some of those best sites.
Good to know. A couple other questions here. I'm going to kind of combine two questions a little bit. If mussels are displaced from their beds by a flow or some other type of event, what factors determine whether they can survive that? And then I'm going to combine that with another question asking, is there a most sensitive time of year for mussels to avoid disturbance?
Yeah, so the first part of that, if mussels are displaced from the bed, one of the key factors of whether it will survive or not that I've seen has been if there is available good bottom substrate outside of the area that they were moved from. So if a mussel lands in kind of the center of the channel around big rocks, often that seems to be when I see them die as a result. But in places like coastal Oregon streams, I find mussels in somewhat high gradient streams with really abundant shifting gravel. And I think that they're able to persist that constant movement because they're moving small amounts with small amounts of the bottom substrate at a time. And so even if they get moved from their original site, they land in habitat that they can just burrow back into. So it's a little bit dependent on the size of the stream and the type of habitat that's available to them. But in some of these bigger flow events, what we do see is that mussels can get scoured out and land on the floodplain. And as the water recedes, there's really nothing that you can do. So I think after that same flow that affected the bed I showed the pictures of, the side channel, people were finding many, many shells as they were just walking the banks. The second part of that about the sensitive times of year, so our mussel species tend to reproduce in the spring months. So that seems to be when they would be most sensitive, really from April through possibly mid-July. It's somewhat dependent on water temperature, and we do see different breeding periods in different rivers based on kind of the normal water temperature. But for example, the site that I showed in the North Fork John Day Basin, I was snorkeling there in May and actually saw them releasing conglutinates. So I knew to the day when that was. But yeah, it's typically the spring months.
All right, thank you. I think we are going to be going to a break here next. So I don't know if you have any other information you want to add, Heather?
Yeah, just that, Emilie, I don't know if you're able to stay with us till the end, but if there are other questions, we can ask those at the end of today. We're going to go to a 15-minute break, and then we're going to start back promptly at 2:55 with our next speaker. So we hope you can join us at that time. Thank you.